So it's important for us to remember that the Zionist movement was a national liberation movement for the Jewish people. And we can't forget that, because that's why people are so attached to it. And it was quite a clever national liberation movement, because essentially they had the idea of, we won't revolt and overthrow somebody here. We'll form our state for ourselves on the moon, someplace far away where nobody cares about, where nobody will be bothered. We'll leave Europe. We'll make them happy because they won't have us to kick around anymore. And we'll have our own self-determination way over here in this place that nobody cares about. They considered themselves a people without a land. And as far as they knew, this was a land without a people. As far as people in Europe mainly knew, this was a desert that was crossed by caravans and camel-riding Bedouins, always on the way to someplace else. So one of the main slogans of the Zionist movement was, a land without a people for a people without a land. So what was the problem with this? There were people there, Palestinians and Jews. Palestinians, some of whom were Christian, many of whom were Muslim by that point, but also Jews, a small minority of them, but Jewish people who had always lived there. Neither the Palestinians nor the Jewish people who lived there liked this Zionist movement very much. Palestinians, because here was a movement calling for a Jewish state, which by definition would prefer some people over other people. So they reasonably feared that they would at best be second-class citizens in somebody else's state. The Jewish people who lived here didn't care for it, because along with the Palestinians, the Arab peoples, it sounded like another colonial movement. I think in some ways it was, in some ways it was not, but it certainly felt like a colonial movement from Europe. And it was a European movement in this way. Furthermore, the national liberation movement that was Zionism encountered a Palestinian national liberation movement that was already underway in Palestine. There was already a political consciousness trying to separate this region of Palestine as its own nation from the Turkish Empire, from the Ottoman Empire. I'm pointing at Turkey over here where my hand is in that way. So this collision of two national liberation movements was, of course, a recipe for some kind of trouble. Now, what exacerbated that trouble was that the European powers got involved, some in support of the Zionist movement. Mostly, the European powers were not concerned with the Arab peoples. Mostly, anti-Arab racism was even worse then than it is today. They just didn't care about that. However, when World War I came around, for example, all the European powers wanted these people on their side. So England, for example, promised this land as a Jewish state and promised it as an Arab state. Pretended they were on the Arab side and on the Jewish side. Britain, of course, was on Britain's side, exactly, in this way. So in the turn of the century and up through World War I and all the way through World War II was developed a sense of entitlement that both Jewish people had to this region and Arab Palestinians had to this region. Again, whether they respected these Western powers or not, they felt that they had been promised their own state in all of what was then historic Palestine. So, of course, there was trouble between them. There was this huge immigration of Jewish people there. It was in some ways facilitated by the British after World War I, when it was a British colony for a while. There were acts of terrorism, that is to say, targeting of civilians, both by the Zionist Jews and by Palestinian Arabs in that time. So violence was escalating, leading all the way up to World War II. Then, of course, in World War II, this huge central event in the modern history of the Jewish people occurred, the Holocaust, the Nazi Holocaust, murder of 6 million people in Europe. And then after World War II, when there were Jewish refugees all through Europe who wanted mainly to come to the United States, and the United States predominantly closed its borders to Jewish refugees from the Holocaust, many of those refugees had no place else to go other than emigrating to Palestine. So after World War II, there was a huge influx of European Jewish refugees. Palestinians took this as even a greater threat. Violence got worse, trouble got worse between the two people. In 1947, the new United Nations suggested dividing this in half, more or less. Actually gave the 55% to a Jewish state and 45% to an Arab state. Neither side liked this very much. Both had been promised all of it. The Jewish people, the Zionists, were willing to accept this because it took them from 0% of historic Palestine to over half, even though they were a minority. So it was at least a good start. The Palestinians absolutely rejected it, even though so many of them would have lived with it, because it took them from 100% to less than half, even though they were clearly a majority of the people in the region. So they found it incredibly unjust. Again, the trouble mounted right after this UN General Assembly resolution. The UN actually was willing to withdraw that resolution. It was too late. There was war. And in that war, which mainly took place in 1948, several things happened which still affect us today. In that war, the Zionist forces took control of this white area here, Israel 48, Israel proper, as we say. In that war, 800,000 Palestinians were driven out from this region. Over 400 Palestinian villages exterminated, literally covered over with bulldozers. It's very important for us to understand that this mass expulsion of 2/3 of the Palestinian population of historic Palestine, much of that at least, possibly most of it by direct Zionist Israeli military action, was the central event in modern Palestinian history. I don't want to compare it in magnitude to the Holocaust or the murder of 6 million people, but in Palestinian consciousness, it plays a similar role. It was a kind of Holocaust. And so until we acknowledge that, any plan that does not acknowledge that and understand that and seek to redress that will tend to fail because it hits so deeply with people.